"You're a liability, Elena," my father said, tossing a one-way bus ticket onto the gravel while my mother adjusted her pearls and looked at the garden instead of my tear-stained face. My dad added, "We don't keep bad investments in this house." I just looked at the dirt, held my stomach and said, "Noted." When the gate finally clicked shut behind me, I stood on the sidewalk and realized I had spent 19 years trying to be the perfect asset for a family that viewed love as a balanced ledger. One I'd just tilted into the red. I did it all without much thanks, always hearing the same line from our parents: "We have a reputation to protect." The Moreno estate sits at the very peak of the hills, the kind of place where the privacy fences are taller than most people's houses and the air feels like something you have to be born into to breathe. The air smells of blooming jasmine and old money, a thick, cloying mix that always makes my throat tight. Tonight was supposed to be a final stand for them. My father, Raphael, was finally watching his corporate empire bleed out after decades of reckless vanity, a legacy he wore like armor. My mother, Lucia, had been planning this emergency donor gala for 6 months, curating every detail from the champagne brand to the seating chart. And that chart was the first sign that tonight wasn't just about survival. It was about hierarchy. The VIP table was set for the city's elite, the people who could still save the Moreno name. My parents at the head, naturally their remaining powerful friends on either side. And then, tucked away in the shadows of the mezzanine, was a sleek black-clad figure they didn't recognize. Me. I'm Elena Moreno. I'm 30 now, sitting in a high-rise office in a city they couldn't find on a map, watching the sunset through bulletproof glass. There is a notice of default on my desk for the very house I was kicked out of 10 years ago. My parents think they are waiting for an anonymous savior. They have no idea they are actually waiting for the liability they threw away. But then the liquidation started. For the Moreno name, a parade of consequences. Process servers moved with the silent efficiency of well-oiled machines, placing foreclosure notices and asset seizures in front of my parents while they tried to sip their vintage wine. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her pearls, a gesture that would have been comical if it wasn't so pathetic. The bus terminal was a symphony of diesel fumes and crushed dreams, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled silence of the Moreno estate. I sat on a hard plastic bench, my fingers trembling as I clutched the manila envelope containing my medical records and the one-way ticket to a city 400 miles away. My stomach felt like a lead weight, and for the first time in my life, I realized that the security my parents had provided was nothing more than a well-maintained cage. As the Greyhound lurched out of the station, I watched the skyline of my childhood disappear into the hazy summer heat. I thought about the charity galas where I was paraded like a trophy, the private tutors who corrected my posture but ignored my mind, and the investments Raphael made in my name that were never about my future but his legacy. I had been a pawn in their social chess game, and the moment I became a piece that didn't fit the board, they simply swept me into the trash. The woman in the seat next to me was asleep, her head lolling against the scratched window. She didn't have a designer handbag or a pedigree, but she had a calmness I envied. I looked down at my own hands, unmarked, soft, and utterly unprepared for the world outside the Moreno gates. I was 19, pregnant, and legally an asset that had been liquidated. But as the miles stretched between me and the people who called me a liability, a cold, hard clarity began to settle in my chest. If I was a bad investment, I would simply have to change the market. I pulled out a small notebook and a pen I'd swiped from my father's desk. I didn't write a diary entry. I began to draft a budget. I calculated the cost of a gallon of milk, the price of a studio apartment in a neighborhood my mother wouldn't even drive through, and the number of hours I'd need to work to keep us alive. The gilded cage was gone, and the wind whistling through the bus's air vents was freezing. But for the first time, I wasn't waiting for a seating chart to tell me where I belonged. I was the one holding the pen. The transition from a mansion to a 12-foot square studio apartment felt like a physical crushing of my lungs. The walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors' coughs, and the air smelled of floor wax and old grease. But it was the first place where no one could tell me I was a liability. I spent the next 4 years in a blur of exhaustion that redefined my understanding of investment. My days were a brutal cycle. Pulling double shifts at a 24-hour diner, scrubbing hospital floors at dawn, and spending my nights in the glow of a flickering desk lamp, finishing my finance degree while my daughter, Sophia, slept in a crib made from a reinforced dresser drawer. I learned more about venture capital in those 4 years than most people learn in a lifetime at Wharton. I learned that every cent was a strategic asset. I learned that time was the only currency you couldn't earn back. While my parents were likely sipping martinis at the country club, I was calculating the caloric value of $1 and using my lunch breaks to study distressed debt markets. I didn't have the luxury of a safety net, so I built a platform of pure grit. Raising Sophia in that cramped room was my greatest act of defiance. I'd read her my textbooks as bedtime stories, my voice steady even when my feet throbbed and my bank account sat at a terrifying $3. I made sure she never felt the coldness of a freezer home. We were poor in cash, but we were rich in a way Rafael Moreno could never understand. We were beholden to no one. By the time I walked across the stage to accept my diploma, Sophia was 3 years old, cheering from the front row in a dress I'd found at a thrift shop and mended by hand. As I shook the dean's hand, I wasn't thinking about the prestige. I was thinking about the notice of default I'd seen in the local business journal regarding one of my father's shell companies. The bad investment had officially graduated. I had my degree, I had my daughter, and I had the first inkling of a plan that would eventually turn my parents' world upside down. The foundation was set. It was time to start building the fortress. Success is a slow-burn transformation, but predatory instincts are born in the shadows. By the time I opened the doors of Vantage Point Capital, I was no longer the girl shivering at a bus stop. I was a hunter who spoke the language of the very ledgers that had once dismissed me. My firm didn't build companies. We acquired the ghosts of failing ones. I specialized in distressed assets, the bloated, dying remains of businesses run by men who thought they were too big to fail. Men exactly like Rafael Moreno. Through a series of offshore subsidiaries and blind trusts, I began my quiet siege. It started with a secondary loan for Moreno Enterprises' logistics wing, a debt Rafael had taken on to cover a disastrous luxury resort venture in the Caribbean. He was desperate, bleeding cash to maintain the appearance of the Moreno prestige, and he was selling his debt to anyone willing to buy. He had no idea that every time he signed a new credit agreement to keep his empire afloat, he was handing another piece of his soul to the daughter he had called a liability. I sat in my office, the city lights reflecting off the dark wood of my desk, and watched the digital transfer confirmations roll in. I bought the mortgage on their summer home. I bought the commercial lease on their flagship office building. I even acquired the high-interest personal line of credit Lucia used to fund her charity balls. I was weaving a net so fine they wouldn't even feel it tighten until they tried to move. To the world, I was an anonymous institutional buyer. To Rafael, I was a nameless savior, a strategic partner, providing the liquidity he needed to survive one more quarter. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he never bothered to look past the corporate seal. He saw a lifeline, I saw a foreclosure. The hunter had spent 10 years learning the terrain, and the prey was now walking straight into the trap, celebrating his good fortune, with the very champagne my firm had technically already repossessed. The collapse of the Moreno dynasty didn't start with a bang. It started with the crisp, terrifying sound of a certified letter being opened in a marble foyer. I watched the security footage from a remote server, a ghost in the machine of the house that had once exiled me. Rafael was standing beneath the crystal chandelier, his face pale as he stared at the document bearing the Vantage Point Capital seal. Beside him, Lucia was still holding a guest list for her upcoming autumn gala, her hand trembling so violently the paper fluttered to the floor like a dying bird. The notice was absolute. Because of a cross-collateralization clause Rafael had signed in a moment of sheer arrogance. His recent business defaults had triggered a total liquidation of his personal assets. The mansion, the vintage car collection, even the lifetime memberships to the Hilltop Country Club. All of it now belonged to my firm. I watched as Rafael grabbed the landline to call his lawyers, only to realize the service had been cut. He looked like a man who had been told the gravity he relied on had suddenly vanished. Lucia's reaction was more visceral. She began frantically touching the antiques, the Ming vases and the velvet drapes, as if her touch could re-establish her ownership of a world that was already gone. They were being evicted from the very fortress they had used to shut me out 10 years ago. The irony was a cold, sharp blade. Rafael had called me a bad investment, yet he was the one who had gambled the family roof on a house of cards. Lucia had worried about the liability of my pregnancy tarnishing her reputation, Yet now she was the one whose name was being whispered about in the locker rooms of the clubs she could no longer enter. As the sun set over the hills, casting long, jagged shadows across their perfectly manicured lawn, the first of the black SUVs arrived. Process servers, moving with the rhythmic precision of a funeral procession, began the formal seizure. I closed the laptop in my high-rise office and leaned back in silence. The gilded cage had finally been dismantled, not by a storm, but by the very daughter they thought they had deleted from their ledger. The voicemail arrived at 10:42 a.m., a trembling relic of a voice I hadn't heard in a decade. My assistant didn't recognize the name, but she flagged it because of the raw desperation in the tone. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the city below me buzzing with the frantic energy of people who still believed they were in control, and I pressed play. To the CEO of Vantage Point Capital, the message began. My mother's voice was thin, stripped of the polished arrogance that had once defined her. My name is Licia Moreno. My husband and we are facing a series of misunderstandings regarding our estate. We are people of standing, and we believe a face-to-face meeting could resolve these clerical errors. Please. We have nowhere else to turn. She sounded like a ghost haunting her own life. I looked at the digital recording, the waveform jumping with every stutter in her breath. She didn't call me Elena. She didn't call me daughter. She was calling a title, a suit, a bank account. She was reaching out to a stranger to save her from the consequences of a man she had spent 30 years enabling. I didn't delete it. I played it again, letting the sound of her fear wash over me like cold rain. 10 years ago, I had begged her for a seat on the bus, for a coat, for a single word of defense against my father's liability speech. She had given me silence and a closed door. Now she was offering me the very thing she had denied me, an audience. I signaled my assistant through the intercom. Schedule it, I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. Tell Mrs. Moreno the CEO will see them tomorrow at 4. And tell her to bring the full accounting of their remaining assets. Every single one. I spent the rest of the afternoon looking at a photo of Sophia on my desk. She has Lucia's eyes but none of her weaknesses. I realized then that my mother wasn't just calling for a loan, she was calling for a miracle. She had no idea that the miracle she was looking for was the same person she had once considered a curse. I wasn't going to be her savior, but I was going to be her mirror. The letter of desperation was signed and delivered. The only thing left was for the ink to dry. The forensic audit was a cold, digital autopsy of a lie. I sat in the darkened theater of my office, the only light coming from the glowing grid of spreadsheets that spanned 3 monitors. For years, Raphael had played the part of the grieving father who had been forced to make a tough financial decision regarding my future. He told me my college fund had vanished in the 2008 crash, a convenient casualty of a global disaster. But as I bypassed the final encryption on his offshore Cayman's account, the truth flickered onto the screen in a series of damning timestamped transactions. The money hadn't been lost to the market, it had been harvested. I watched the digital trail as my father systematically drained the trust my grandmother had left for me. $200,000, diverted in $50,000 increments, not to cover family emergencies, but to pay off the interest on his failing real estate shell companies. He hadn't just kicked me out when I was pregnant. He had spent the preceding 4 years ensuring I had no safety net to fall back on. He had embezzled my education to buy himself another 6 months of pretending to be a mogul. The air in the office felt suddenly thin. It was one thing to be rejected for a mistake. It was another to realize that my liability was actually a cover for his own. He needed me to be the failure, the social outcast, the bad investment, because it justified the fact that there was no money left for me anyway. He'd projected his own financial insolvency onto my character. I printed the statements, the ink still warm as the pages slid into the tray. Every line item was a betrayal, a deliberate theft of the life I was supposed to have. I realized then that my parents hadn't just closed the door on a 19-year-old girl. They had stolen the keys to the door before she could even reach it. I placed the documents into a sleek, black folder marked Moreno Restructuring. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock I wasn't just going to show them who I had become. I was going to show them exactly what they had stolen, and then I was going to hand them the bill. With interest. The boardroom was a cathedral of glass and cold, hard numbers, bathed in the late afternoon sun that spilled over the city. My parents sat on one side of the massive obsidian table, looking like ghosts haunted by their own reflections. Raphael was fidgeting with a gold watch he no longer legally owned, while Lucia kept smoothing her skirt, her eyes darting to the heavy oak door every time she heard a footstep. They were waiting for a savior, a nameless titan of industry who would surely understand their standing. When the door finally opened, I didn't rush. I walked in with the measured stride of someone who owned the air in the room. I took my seat at the head of the table, remained silent for a heartbeat, and then slowly turned my chair to face them. The silence that followed was absolute. Lucia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in a terror I hadn't seen since the night she watched me walk away with that bus ticket. Raphael's face went through a sickening kaleidoscope of colors, from a startled red to a translucent chalky white. "Elena," he croaked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "What is the meaning of this? Where is the CO?" "You're looking at her, Raphael," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "But in this room I'm not your daughter. I'm your primary creditor." I slid the black folder across the table. It didn't contain a loan agreement. It contained the audit of betrayal. I watched as Raphael's eyes scanned the documents, the offshore transfers, the diverted college fund, the decade of embezzlement he'd hidden behind the lie of a market crash. "You called me a liability," I continued, leaning forward into the light. "You said I was a bad investment. But while you were stealing my future to pay for your vanity, I was building a firm that could buy and sell your legacy before you finished your morning coffee." Lucia began to sob, a quiet, pathetic sound that didn't move me. "Elena, please, we're your family." "Family is a bond, Lucia," I replied. "Not a transaction. You treated me like a line item you could delete when the math got difficult. While the audit is complete, you've been found insolvent in every way that matters." I watched the realization sink in. The moment they understood that the person they had discarded was the only one who could decide if they had a roof over their heads tonight. The big reveal wasn't just about my success. It was about the total liquidation of their illusions. The heavy brass keys to the Moreno estate felt surprisingly light in my palm, a cold bit of metal that had once represented the limits of my world. We stood on the wide portico of the mansion, the sunset casting long, distorted shadows of the fluted columns across the limestone. Raphael and Lucia stood by their luxury SUV, one of the few personal items I'd allowed them to keep out of a cold, calculated mercy, watching me with a mixture of terror and a pathetic, lingering hope that I might invite them back inside. "Elena," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "The gardens, the roses are just starting to bloom. Surely we can discuss a lease agreement? A way for us to stay in our home." I looked at her and then at the house. I saw the window of the room where I'd been told I was a liability. I saw the driveway where I'd stood with a single suitcase while they turned their backs. To them this was a home. To me it was a museum of emotional neglect, a freezer, where I had spent 19 years shivering. "This isn't a home, Lucia," I said, my voice echoing in the evening air. "It's a distressed asset. And I've already found a better use for it." I turned to the woman standing beside me, the director of New Beginnings, a local foundation that provided transitional housing for young single mothers. I pressed the keys into her hand. "The deed has been transferred," I announced, loud enough for my parents to hear. "Effective immediately, the Moreno estate is a shelter. Those bedrooms you were so worried about tarnishing? They're going to be filled with women who actually know how to fight for their children. The ballroom will be a vocational center. This house is finally going to serve a purpose that isn't vanity." The look of pure aristocratic horror on my father's face was the only dividend I needed. To him, giving the family seat to charity cases was a fate worse than bankruptcy. I didn't wait for his outburst. I walked down the steps, past the man who had stolen my college fund and the woman who had watched him do it. I didn't look back at the mansion as I got into my car. I didn't need the keys to a cage I had already outgrown. I was leaving the past behind in the hands of people who would fill those cold rooms with warmth, while I drove toward a future that was finally, irrevocably mine. The light in my new home was different from the light in the Moreno estate. It wasn't filtered through heavy velvet or designed to highlight expensive statues. It was clean, honest, and warm, pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a future I had built with my own hands. Sophia was sitting at the kitchen island, her math homework spread out before her, humming a song she'd learned at school. She looked up and smiled, a bright, unburdened expression that was never measured against a social calendar or a family ledger. I set a glass of water down next to her, resting my hand briefly on her shoulder. 10 years ago I was a liability being escorted to the gates. Today I was the sole proprietor of my life. I had spent so much of my youth trying to prove my worth to people who used a broken calculator to measure human value. I realized now that the bad investment my father had scoffed at was actually the only thing in his life that had ever truly grown. By casting me out, he hadn't destroyed me. He had inadvertently liquidated the only part of himself that had any real substance. I sat down at my own desk and opened a small leather-bound book. It wasn't a ledger of debts or a collection of foreclosure notices. It was the legacy fund I had established for Sophia. In it, I had recorded the transfer of the funds I had recovered from my stolen college account, plus the interest I'd earned through Vantage Point. But more importantly, I had written a letter on the first page. It told her that her value was inherent, that she would never have to buy her way into a room, and that she was never, ever an expense. I looked out at the city where the lights were beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. My parents were out there somewhere, finally learning the true cost of their transactional love, but they were no longer my concern. I had stopped shivering. The air in this house was perfect. I watched Sophia finish her last problem and close her book, her eyes bright with the simple, quiet confidence of a child who is loved without fine print. I realized then that the only investment that ever mattered, the only one that paid out in peace instead of pride, was the one I had made in myself on that long, cold bus ride 10 years ago. The audit was finally closed and the balance was perfect. If this story hit home, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.